Hello, let's jump right in and talk about the death penalty. Probably one of the most controversial issues in the criminal justice system today. Now, this first slide, every time I teach this class, I need to update this slide because literally these statistics continue to change. So this is the most recent map that is available. It's 2015 data. And ultimately, just to run through this real quick, so the countries outlined or colored with blue have abolished the death penalty altogether. There is no crime, no entity that can give the death penalty. The countries that are outlined in yellow basically have parameters that say in what they call ordinary crime, but basically they only allow the death penalty for extremely significant crimes. Normally, it needs to be murder that it was somehow aggravated. The green countries still technically have death penalty statutes or allow the death penalty through their laws and statutes, however, have not executed anyone in at least 10 years. The red countries are retentionist countries. These are countries that still have the death penalty. So you see the United States is one of those countries. So ultimately, what that really boils down to is around the world, 58 countries still have. Now, I have needed to change that again every time I teach this class. We are up to 140 countries that have abolished it. And let me tell you, to kind of give you a date, when I first started teaching in 2005, that number was 133, I believe, right around there. And so we are continuing to see internationally more and more countries moving away from the death penalty. And although, as I said, the United States still does have the death penalty. It is allowed in 33 different states. The military allows the death penalty, as well as the federal government. I'm going to switch to a fact sheet, and I did something different here. So you see a files pod. You can, if you click on that, you can download this handout right to your desktop or wherever you want to save if you want to take a look at it later, because I'm just going to go through it real quickly. Here you see the first graph, I guess, is the number of executions. And so through the years, you see we had some peak years there, and we've continued to kind of decline. It's stabilized a little bit, but you see this last year, we've had a significant decrease in the number of executions. Scrolling down, you see one of the biggest challenges of the death penalty is the race of the defendant as well as the race of victims. Now, one thing that people are shocked here saying, wow, it's mostly white people. You need to take a look again at the population. We know that our population is predominantly Caucasian Americans. Where we get concerned is the racial minority representation. It is disproportionate, significantly disproportionate to the general population. One of the other things that we are currently dealing with is the race of the victim seems to influence whether or not the defendant gets the death penalty. If the victim is white, the defendant is much more likely to get the death penalty than if the victim was non-white. All right, scrolling down to the next page, just some recent studies. Go ahead and read these. I'm not going to go through each one of them. This particular graph talks about innocence, where we've been able to demonstrate that we have executed folks who are later definitively shown to be innocent. You see these numbers are decreasing, which is very good. We think that's due in large part to improvements in technology, DNA, those types of things. This is also due to the excessive appeals process. Now, a lot of people struggle with that appeals process because it does take a really, really long time. But since we've implemented that, look how we have decreased in numbers. Now, that goes by state, but we've decreased significantly. So we talk here more about race, inmates by state. Go ahead and take a look at that if you're from a state that has it or are just curious. Right now we do have just over 3,000 inmates on death row. This breaks it down a little bit more by state as well. Um, Here, what's interesting is talking about whether or not folks believe that the death penalty is a deterrent. And what's interesting is it's resoundingly no, not considered to be a deterrent. We're talking about methods. Juveniles, since 2005, juveniles have no longer been eligible due to a Supreme Court case. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Financial facts, I'll talk about that more than just a little bit, but take a look at that. Public opinion, what's interesting is that we have seen through the Gallup polls, we've seen basically a great decrease in public support of the death penalty, especially when we offer the option of life without parole. Folks are more supportive of that than the death penalty. So again, this fact sheet, you can download it here, take a closer look at it, but it's got some really interesting tidbits about the death penalty. This is a very scholarly source. It's from the Death Penalty Information, unbiased, nonpartisan source. So some great information there. All right, let's go back to my slide deck. All right, so most states have reduced the death penalty to only what they call capital crimes. But what's interesting is that definition is going to vary by state. Some have very limited, saying it is only if you are accused of killing someone, first-degree murder, that has some type of aggravating factors, saying, if the victim was very young or vulnerable in some way. Some states require that it be multiple murders, and so some are very broad, some are very narrow. Some states do allow, very few states allow it with for certain cases of rape or treason. So we see great variation there. Now, in 1994, the Violent Crime Control Act basically said, gave states some guidelines of what they needed or could include. The federal government, as I said, the federal government does still allow for the death penalty. However, in order for it to be carried out or someone to be eligible for the death penalty based on a federal offense, it first needs to be authorized by the Attorney General. Of course, we have a new Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, so it'll be interesting to see kind of how she sits on these particular cases. However, if the Attorney General authorizes the death penalty, basically that defendant then is entitled to having 2 lawyers in their defense, and yes, taxpayer dollars will pay for those. One of them has to be experienced in death penalty cases, and they both must be on what we call the good list, in that they're approved for federal public defenders, so they don't have anything pending against malpractice or anything like that. All federal inmates are housed in the same penitentiary, in the same prison. It's a U.S. penitentiary, so at that federal level in Terre Haute, Indiana, is where all federal death penalty inmates are going to be housed. The states that do still allow the death penalty, we technically have 5 different methods still on the books that are still considered adequate or legitimate ways to execute someone. However, lethal injection is by far the most common. So those 5 methods: lethal injection, electric chair, yes, some states still allow the gas chamber, hanging, as well as firing squad. But again, lethal injection is the primary method for the death penalty. And let me just kind of walk you through the current process. Basically, the inmate is going to be first strapped down. They may be given a sedative prior, just to kind of calm them in, so they don't react violently to being strapped down. At that point, then, we will insert 2 needles into their arm. One of those needles is solely for backup. It normally is never used. It's just in case the first needle fails. At that point, they will start a saline drip just to keep that line open. At that point, then, if it's a state that allows the curtain to be raised, so there can be, if there's spectators for the execution, at that point, then they will raise the curtain. Then we start what is known as sodium thiopental. Of course, these recipes are confidential; they are private, and that's actually the Supreme Court is contemplating the recipe. Should it be disclosed? It's a violation. They're arguing that it's violating cruel and unusual punishment, and so because there's been some challenges in some recent death penalty cases, and so that's why the Supreme Court is taking a look at it. So the sodium thiopental is a general anesthetic that will generally put them. Its goal is to put them to sleep. Then they do Pavulon, and ultimately that paralyzes their entire system and will stop their breathing. It's the last drug, the potassium chloride, which will stop their heart. The heart is a very, very strong muscle, is difficult to stop. We do Pavulon first to basically paralyze their system, but we do that, and it was in this process to avoid the cruel and unusual punishment, to avoid the pain, because stopping the heart can be very, very painful, and it's the potassium chloride that does that. Now, the American Medical Association, when someone becomes a doctor, they swear to this code of ethics, and ultimately, the code of ethics does not allow doctors to participate. They basically they agree and swear to do no harm and to not facilitate in anyone's death. So that's why doctors are not involved in this process. It's correctional officers who are administering the medications. As I said earlier, the Gallup poll, we continue to see through states or through the years that there is less and less support nationwide for the death penalty. And again, when we ask someone, would they prefer the death penalty or without parole, they will pick life without parole. Supreme Court cases that have been or instrumental in the death penalty. 1972 said the death penalty was cruel and unusual because states were arbitrary and not fair. There was great inconsistencies. There was too much discretion provided. So basically in 1972, it commuted everyone who was currently sitting on death row. There was actually 629 offenders on death row, commuted them all to life in prison. Basically, in response to that, many states just rewrote their death penalty statutes. And basically, they did mandatory for some crimes. Some used what they called guided discretion, which had these criteria. In 1976, in Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court said you cannot have mandatory statutes on the death penalty. However, you can have what is known as guided discretion. And what that case also did was it automatically allowed for appeal. It also bifurcated the trial. Basically, bifurcated just means we break something into two. And so if someone is being accused of a crime that would make them eligible for the death penalty, they're first going to have a hearing. That's the fact finding. We first need to prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Once we've established that, then we go into the death penalty hearing. And that's where they're going to look at mitigating and aggravating factors. Is there mitigating factors that make something less, that this person should not receive the death penalty? Are there aggravating factors? Makes it worse, that makes them more eligible, or the public opinion is that they should be eligible for the death penalty. The current appeals process. So once someone is put on death row, so that bifurcated trial, the first one found them guilty, the second one said, yep, you're eligible for the death penalty. But then again, it's a mandatory appeals process. That time is taking, on average, 10 years and 7 months. So why is it taking so long? I have basically a little map here. And this is not, we're not talking about federal cases here. So basically it starts at that state trial. The state system in and of itself is going to have an appeals process. So the state trial is going to find them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Then it's going to go to that state appeals process. 41% of those cases are going to find some type of error. Now remember, you can't appeal just because you don't like the decision. You can only appeal If you believe there's been a mistake in either the interpretation of the Constitution, a violation um, or a violation of your rights. In these cases, about 41% are finding that there was a serious error made, so the appeals court is most likely going to then send that back to the state trial. If not, they can then request what is known as a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court. It's basically asking the Supreme Court case to review this. The only thing we're asking the Supreme Court to do is if we believe there's been a violation of the Constitution. If the Supreme Court agrees to hear it and agrees that there's been a violation, it's going to kick it back to the state trial and go through that process again. Or they might then bring it to federal district court. If this is also an issue at the federal level, they can kick it up a notch to the federal court and then go through that process. And at the Federal Court of Appeals, they have about a 40%. At this third level, the Federal District Court, it's mainly talking about what's known as habeas corpus. And it's that a writ of habeas corpus basically says it's wrongful incarceration of this body. If this appeals process is not successful, at that point, then their execution date is set. But again, 10 years, 7 months, because we have a very, very thorough appeals process. All right, then lastly, just some what I call odds and ends about the death penalty. Again, as I said, as of 2005, we can no longer execute juveniles. So Supreme Court case of Roper versus Simmons. Basically, it was found that executing juveniles violates the 8th Amendment. Prior to that, the Supreme Court said we can no longer execute the mentally retarded. Now, I put sick on there. I know mentally retarded is no longer politically correct in terminology. However, that's the terminology that the Supreme Court used at the time. The case was Adkins versus Virginia. And what's interesting is it too found that this violated the 8th Amendment. And the criteria that they used is for mental retardation, we generally are referring to someone who has an IQ of 70 or lower. And so that was the criteria that they found where if your IQ is 70 or lower, we cannot make you eligible for the death penalty. Now, keep in mind, this is not talking about mental illness. This is talking about IQ, or what we would refer to as developmentally disabled in today's world. Now, as I started this conversation, I said this is the most highly debated, controversial issue in the criminal justice system. I'm not here to argue. Everyone's going to have their own opinion, but I wanted to bring into just some of the primary arguments that we hear. And I'm not here to influence your opinion. But first and foremost, a lot of people are going to support the death penalty because of that retribution. Remember, early in the quarter, we talked about goals of sentencing. One of the primary goals of sentencing is retribution, getting back at. People believe that the death penalty is either morally correct, or if you're opposed to that, they think it's immoral. So they're really talking about the morality of the death penalty. Some Christians might resort to the Bible in trying to debate the death penalty. The cost. Now, this one, again, I'm not here to influence your decision. However, one of the arguments I often hear is that it's much cheaper to execute someone. That is absolutely, positively untrue. It is extensively more expensive to execute someone. And a lot of that has to deal with those appeals, that court process. It literally costs several $1 million to execute someone, where holding someone life in prison, $25,000 a year. It is significantly cheaper to house someone for life in prison versus executing them. Some talk about the deterrence level. Now, that handout talked about deterrence a little bit. If you believe that the death penalty deters, I would tell you that there's a lot of research that shows it actually doesn't. We look at several different factors. We look at states that currently have the death penalty versus states that don't. And actually, states that have the death penalty have significantly higher crime rates and murder rates than states that don't. So there's not a whole lot of research that supports that the death penalty is actually a deterrent. So those are some of the arguments